Hey, film class. All right, for the next unit, we're going to focus on the visual elements of film. And we're going to try to examine how those visual components help to affect an audience, to help a director manipulate an audience. Now, we've already gotten a good foundation for the visual elements of film when we studied terminologies in the last unit. You learned terminologies for composition, things like tight or loose framing or asymmetrical compositions, or all the different lighting techniques that are possible. We also learned terminology for camera movements, pan, tilt, zoom, dolly zoom. And then we learned terminology for editing, things like parallel editing or expressive juxtaposition. These are all labels to put on concepts that directors can employ or techniques that directors can employ, and they all have an outcome. They all have some sort of effect on an audience. Your job in this unit is going to be to measure both what techniques were used, identify which techniques were used, and measure the effect on the audience. Now, we've already done this a little bit, like with this scene in Chinatown. This scene in Chinatown is a good example of how the composition of the frame reinforces the story. And we spent a little time talking about this in class. But we're going to take this a little further. Now, we could use any genre when we're studying these techniques. Comedies are funnier depending on how the camera moves or where the cut is placed. Dramas can be more suspenseful depending on where a character is placed in relationship to another character and how the camera captures that. And romances can be sadder depending on the point of view that the camera adopts during the filming of a scene. Whether you're in tight or whether you're getting a medium shot, you get a different feeling from the characters. But we're going to use horror films. Now, I'm not a big horror film fan myself. I do not watch them for fun. I do not like being scared. But if you're looking for a genre of film where the work of the director, where the camera movements, where the editing, where the composition of a frame has a direct effect on an audience, I don't think there is a better genre than horror. I mean, think about it. You've watched a horror film when you know something is going to happen, when there's suspense being built, and the muscles in your neck and shoulders start to tighten up, and you start to get really nervous. That's accomplished through camera movement. That's accomplished through composition. In the same way, you've seen a whole audience of heads jump when a cut happens or when an object invades the frame in such a way as it creates a startle. That is the camera movement and the editing techniques and the composition creating a visible effect on an audience. You see them jump. So while horror is not my favorite genre, it is probably the best possible source, the best possible genre to study what we're trying to study. The impact of the visual elements of film on an audience. Now, the project for this is going to be a little different. It's not going to be a paper. It's going to be more like a how-to manual. You're going to try to explain to an audience 3 different standard horror film techniques. You're going to do it in sort of a how-to way. This is going to be a manual, a step-by-step guide as to how to create certain shots. So your goal here is to put together a document that someone could read, and by reading this document, recreate those shots with a camera and some lights. A how-to technical writing. Now, there are probably dozens of horror film techniques that you've seen repeated over and over and over again. You're going to have to first identify these techniques as they're used in the films that we watch in class. Then you're going to want to find 3 techniques that you're going to describe in some detail. Those techniques are going to be visual, so nothing with soundtrack. Although soundtrack is a part of horror films, we're not studying that right now. You're going to concentrate on 3 different visual techniques that you see a director employ that has an effect on an audience. Now, for each of those techniques, you need to have 3 sections. A visual section, a verbal section, and then an example section. The visual section In the visual section, you're going to give us an illustration of this technique as it's used in film. Now, if it's an element of composition, like how elements are arranged in the frame or how something is lit, a single frame will do. So you'll draw a frame and you'll illustrate the technique. Or you'll find a still image online that has the technique illustrated in an image, on a photo. But if it's an element of, if it's a camera movement thing or an editing technique, then you're probably going to need multiple, at least 2 frames. The first frame will show us what the camera looks like at the beginning, and then the second frame will show us where the camera goes. Or the first frame will show us what we're looking at before the cut, and then the second frame shows us what happens after the cut. So multiple images will be necessary to do editing techniques or camera movement techniques most of the time. That's the visual section. You can do it by using stick figures. You can use it by grabbing stills from the internet. Whatever way you think is going to best convey the idea that you're trying to explain to an audience. Second portion of this is going to be the verbal section. In the verbal section, there's going to be 3 parts. The first part is the what does it look like? In the what does it look like section, you're basically explaining what it is that we're seeing in the visual image. You drew something. What is that representing? So you're going to describe the technique to us by explaining what we see in the images that you've drawn or captured from the internet. The second section is the why would they use this? So what is the intent? What is the purpose of this technique? Why is the director using it? What is the goal? What is the outcome here? And then finally, the how do you do it section. And this is probably the most detailed. This is where you're going to use bullet points or numbering to go through a step-by-step, how do we accomplish this shot? And this is where you'll have a great chance to employ all those film terms that we learned last unit. So how is the camera moving? What do we cut to? What do we cut from? How is it lit? Pretend you wanted me to shoot the scene that you're trying to describe. One of the 3 techniques that you're going to explain. How would I set it up? How would I move the camera? How would I edit it to make it work exactly the way it worked in the examples that you have seen in class? 3 parts to the verbal. What does it look like? Why would I use this? And then step by step, using film terminology, how do I accomplish it? The last part of the project is just going to be examples. You're going to give your readers some examples from the films that we've seen in class that they can look at to understand better what it is you're trying to explain. The example section, you need to use 2 examples from at least 2 different films from the 3 that we'll watch in class. So for every technique, and you're going to explain 3 different techniques. For every technique, what does it look like? Why do they do it? How do they do it? An image and 2 examples for each technique. For each technique. All right, that's the assignment. Hopefully it's a little more fun than doing the paper, and also I think it's just a better format for trying to relay this kind of information. By being able to explain how we shoot this or how a director shoots this, you demonstrate an understanding of all of these techniques both in name and in practical application. It's not that just you know what a close-up is, you know why you would use a close-up and what the effect is on an audience. So there you go, the visual elements of film. We're going to watch 3 films in class to give you some examples to pull from. We'll watch a couple of short films as well. And then you'll have some time to put that project together. And a due date, of course, will be announced in Canvas when that's ready. So, as always, if you have questions, make sure you shoot me an email. I hope you enjoyed the unit. Thanks.